Uriel Simon, professor of Bible at Bar-Ilan University, tells the story of when he was 7 years old and he was sick and he had to stay home alone the entire day. He asked his father, "What am I going to do?" In those days, they didn't have toys and they didn't have children's books. So his father took a copy of the Bible, shoved it into his hands and said, "Read this." So young Uriel started reading the stories in the Bible, and when he came to the stories about Yosef and his brothers, and he read about the terrible cruelty of the brothers to Yosef, he cried and cried. More than 70 years have elapsed since then, and continuously, Professor Simon has come back to these stories, ultimately to discover that in fact these stories are optimistic, telling us something very optimistic about the human condition, that people can change for the better. And even when there's great enmity between people, this can be overcome. Some of his findings he put into his book, Bakes Shalom V'Radfehu, which was awarded Israel's highest prize in literature, the Bialik Prize. I would like to begin by sharing with you some of the general points that Professor Simon makes about the story of Yosef and his brothers. Much of the troubles in Yaakov's house stem from the favoritism Yaakov demonstrates towards Yosef. This favoritism is bilateral. Just as Yaakov favors Yosef over his brothers, Yosef chooses loyalty to his father above solidarity with his brothers, and he brings negative reports of his brothers' misdoings to his father. And this situation creates hatred, animosity, and jealousy. And this is vented both against Yosef, who is sold to slavery, and to Yaakov, who is also treated very cruelly. The sons bring Yosef's clothes covered with blood and ask Yaakov, "Can you identify who do these clothes belong to?" But from this low point, the story begins to change. Yaakov falls into deep, deep grief, and the brothers, Yaakov's sons, try to console him unsuccessfully, and here they begin to have misgivings, regrets about what they've done. So in life, you don't always get a second chance, but at least to one of the brothers, Yehuda, is given a second chance. The Rambam defines repentance, tshuva, as going back to the same situation that you found yourself in and choosing good instead of evil. And this is what happens with Yehuda. Yaakov's favoritism for Yosef is transferred later to favoritism from Yosef's brother Binyamin. Now, had things continued as they were before, the animosity towards Yosef should have been replaced by animosity of the brothers towards Binyamin. And as a result, when Binyamin is falsely accused of theft and sentenced to be thrown into jail, the brothers, if they stayed the same way that they were before, we would expect them to be deeply satisfied at the outcome. However, here we see the change in the brothers. Yehuda, not only does he accept the fact that Binyamin is his father's favorite son now, in recognition of that fact, Yehuda sacrifices himself, offers to be thrown into prison instead of Binyamin in order to save him and spare his father additional anguish. So we have the fact of the favoritism of Binyamin, instead of bringing Yehuda to do an act of evil, selling someone to slavery, he accepts it and sacrifices himself in respect of his father. And Yosef sees this very noble act, and Yosef responds. He's overcome with emotion. He calls all the Egyptians, asks all the Egyptians to leave the room, and then the person who is the most powerful man in Egypt, other than the Paro, reveals his true identity in what is perhaps the most dramatic moment in all of Tanakh, when he reveals that he is none other than Yosef, the lost brother. And this story is part of a larger story of relationships between brothers that goes throughout the book of Bereshit. And there's much enmity between the brothers, but if you look carefully throughout the stories, more and more the brothers find ways to find reconciliation. In the first pair of brothers, Cain and Hevel, their relationship ended with murder. Progressively, we have relatively happier endings with the other brothers. Yishmael and Yitzchak, despite the tension between them, we find them together at the burial scene, coming together to the Marat HaMachpelah in Hebron to bury their father. Yaakov and Esav, the next generation, again a pair of brothers with great enmity between them. We find them too burying their father together, a sign of their reconciliation. But more than that, we find them coming closer together, Esav hugging and kissing Yaakov, and both of them weeping, both of them crying perhaps on the lost years in their relationship. And then finally, at the end of the book of Bereshit, we find Yosef and his brothers, that not only are they reconciled, but they undergo deep changes, allowing them to be in a very different relationship. And this is the backdrop for Sefer Shemot, which begins with two brothers who have an idyllic relationship with one another, Moshe and Aaron. I would like to take these insights of Professor Simon and the central role that he demonstrates the relationship between brothers play in Bereshit, and try to take it to even a broader context. In a word, if I had to define what is the major topic in Sefer Bereshit, I would say family. Because so much of Bereshit deals with relationships, as we've mentioned, relationship between brothers, but also between husband and wife, children and parents. And this is somewhat surprising because Bereshit presumably is giving us the background for the formation of a nation, the formation of a people. And we would expect to hear about wars and politics and international relations, but rather so much of what happens is in the context of family. And I think this is coming to teach us that more than Am Yisrael is a nation, more than we are a people, we are a family. And this goes back to how we relate to our founders, that they are the fathers and the mothers. And the first founder, Avraham, whose very name, Av, means father. And the fact that the Torah tells us that Avraham was chosen because, as God says, that I know that you will teach your children after you to go in the way of God. And this family aspect of the Jewish people has two dimensions. First of all, the dimension that within the context of the significance of relationships within the classical nuclear family. And a second step is to see that the entirety of the Jewish people are a family. And much of the laws of the Torah are presented as relationship one another are called ach, and a brother. And the usage of the word brother to refer to a fellow citizen is not an external point, but a point that gets to the essence of the nature of our relationship. A relationship which is not based merely on live and let live, not based merely on not hurting other people, but a relationship based on mutual responsibility. And as someone who grew up outside of Israel and now lives in Israel, I could appreciate the solidarity in Israeli society and not take for granted things that many Israelis, I believe, do take for granted. A recent example in the story with Gilad Shalit, there was a very legitimate debate about whether to free terrorists in order to free Gilad Shalit. But relating whatever side of the issue anyone took, all felt in their heart that Gilad was part of their family. All felt closeness and a solidarity with the Shalit family. And I know in America there are so many prisoners of wars, not only in the Vietnam days, but even nowadays in Afghanistan, and so few have interest or even know about the existence of those people. And sometimes from the outside, people see in Israel how the tones are so loud and people are so often debate with one another. But this also, I think, is a characteristic of us being a family. In the family, we're very close to one another, but also here and then we fight with each other. Now, there are nations that took the opposite approach. Instead of what I see as the Jewish approach, starting with the rock being the relationships in the family and then expanding that out to be relationships within the people as a whole, there are those that thought things should work the other way. That in Natan Sharansky, in his book Fear No Evil, talks about Soviet ideology, in which they believe that loyalty to the family comes at the expense of loyalty to the nation, to the state. So as a result, part of the ideology was a breakdown of trust and loyalty to the family. And there's a story that Sharansky brings down of, there are times that the Soviet government would take the grain away from the farmers, promising to give some of it back at some time, often as not giving it back, leaving the farmers and their families to starve. And there was a farmer who decided to hide some of the grain so that he should have food for his family. And one of his sons, wanted to be a good citizen, went and reported on his father. And his father was arrested and sent away to Siberia. And the family was so incensed by this act of treachery in the family that they killed that son. And this son became a Soviet hero because he put the needs of the state above that of the family. But as history teaches us, the result is not always what the Soviets thought it would be. And the lack of loyalty to the family did not lead necessarily to greater loyalty to the state. As my grandfather once put it in a joke that he told me, that a Russian child was once asked, "Who is your father?" And he answered, "Father Stalin." "And who is your mother?" "Mother Russia." "And what do you want to be when you grow up?" "An orphan," answered the child. I'd like to conclude with one more insight about what Sefer Bereshit teaches us about relationships in the family. At the end of Parshat Toldot, Rivka is defined as being Rivka, the mother of Esav and Yaakov. And Rashi writes that, I don't know why is the Torah telling us this, because we know this already. Anybody who's been following the story in Sefer Bereshit knows by that point that Rivka is the mother of Esav and Yaakov. Why do we need this redundancy? Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch explains that this is to teach us that often when there are conflicts in the family and people start taking sides, often this leads to a breakdown in the basic family relationship. So we may think that because Rivka believed that Yaakov was the one who should receive the blessings, she is now on Yaakov's side and against Esav, and against that, the Torah teaches us Rivka is the mother of Esav and Yaakov. Despite doing what she did for Yaakov, she remained a mother not only to Yaakov, but also to Esav. And this is an important lesson for all of us, that we could debate on any issues, but we must always remember we're all the same family. Shabbat Shalom.